إنما هو التوحيد وتوحيد العبادة بالذات.
And you see people all over the world. You see Muslims all over the world. They know more about Hollywood movies than they know about who the Sahaba are. They know more about the cultural norms of Western society, right? And the sexual norms and how they're supposed to act and behave and dress. And Muslims imitate this, right? Rather than accepting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says through His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Muslims abandon the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they accept the norms and the beliefs and the narratives of the Western conquerors. And this has been going on for 200 years or more, and it continues right up until today. So this is a very important point. The other point I mentioned here is the British and the French in the 13th, 19th century particularly excelled at this as they sought to devalue local languages and social institutions while promoting European culture. And we can see this from North Africa all the way to Indochina, so beyond the Islamic world. The French came into North Africa, the French went into Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and we know the horror stories, how they behaved. They tore down in North Africa, Algeria, they tore down all of the Islamic institutions. They undermined the language, and they undermined the educational system of the Muslims. They undermined the endowment system, the Waqf system. Everything was torn down. And all French or European models were put in place. So people in North Africa, in order for them to have access to power and wealth, they had to learn how to speak French, and they had to adopt French ways. People in Vietnam, the same thing happened. As the British went into Egypt and went into India, we see the same thing. The local culture, local language, local beliefs and practices are all denigrated. They're all humiliated, and they set up a whole colonial structure. And anybody in Egypt, anybody in India, anybody anywhere wants to be part of the power structure, they have to play the so-called European game. And this this is well known. And we could see some, and we'll see some of the evidence of this. A close scrutiny of European imperialism since the 12th and 18th century bears this out without exception. And I mention here, starting with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when the British East India Company gained control of what is now Bangladesh, all the way to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Western powers have carried out policies exactly as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned in the Quran. When the British East India Company defeated the Mughal armies in 1757, what did they do? They take over the country. They take over the economic system. They gain control of taxation. They gain control of all the political institutions. And so the people in their own country now are subservient to the colonial masters. And the people in what is now Bangladesh at that time, still part of the Mughal Empire, they had to submit to the demands of the British East India Company. And when we take a close look at what happened in Iraq in 2003, 2004, we see the exact same thing. The Americans came in, they tore apart the Iraqi government. They imposed all policies on the people of Iraq. They took over control of the oil industry, the economic system, and we see the results of this. We're living through the results of this. The whole system in Iraq, the whole culture in Iraq is torn apart. And we're not saying there weren't problems before the invasion, and we're not saying that Saddam Hussein was this wonderful ruler, but the results of the way the Americans went about carrying out this invasion follows the same line that we've seen for 200 years or more. So governments are destroyed, populations are thrown into turmoil, as wealth of the land is siphoned off, in this case, to Western banks. Just to give a slightly broader overview. Of course, we cannot, go over the entire history of imperialism and colonialism, but what I want to do is just list, at least to bring about some of the effects of what Western culture, what Western powers have done over the past 200, 300, 400 years. So we still live under the effects of the whole Atlantic slave trade. Right? And this is 400 years of sustained policy of buying and selling people. Right? The slave trade from Africa to the Latin America, the Caribbean, Central America, North America went on for almost 400 years, right? Making Western banks, Western culture, Western investors fabulously wealthy, while destroying dozens of cultures in Africa, indigenous populations in Central America. So that whole slave trade, when it was all based on, as we'll see, the racial policies that prevailed in the West, in Europe. You have the subjugation of indigenous peoples. Again, this stretches across a whole range, but even if you just look at what happened to the native populations in North and South America, from the Aztecs to the Incas to the native populations here in North America, right? What these cultures and peoples went through. The enforcement of maintaining agricultural economies in Central and South America. And of course, one of the things that the Western powers did as part of an economic colonial policy was to make sure that the conquered territories never industrialized. So it's not accidental that Central South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia remained the raw material suppliers to Western manufacturing. And it's only post-World War II that we see the rise of industrialization in some countries like India and China, trying to industrialize and facing all continued problems as the West tries to impose economic and now using issues about global pollution and whatnot. So anything and everything to prevent non-Western populations and countries from reaching a level of sophistication similar to the West. Now this is happening, and this is why the world is in a global transition taking place, because China and India and other countries, but these are the two big ones right now, are reaching towards this parity, economic and industrial parity. But this is something that was intentional policy on the colonial powers right up through to the end of colonialism, which was World War II, and then what happened in the aftermath of World War II. Another point is something we call the scramble for Africa, how the entire continent of Africa became colonized, and the brutality of that colonization. From Cecil Rhodes, who took over parts of South Africa, to the Belgians and in the Congo. I mean, you could just go through the list after the list of what the Europeans had done as they took over these territories. So all of Africa is colonized. Humiliation of China, Southeast Asia, well into the 14th century. I mean, we could go back to the 1830s, 1840s, the British and their opium wars, right, and what they did in India and what they did in China, and how the European powers tried to control the economy and policies of China. Right? So you have this issue. And then the last point, the continued post-colonial attempts of Western powers to control the governments and economies of so-called third world countries through the manipulative policies of the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Right? Again, this is a huge issue in terms of when these organizations were created, post-World War II, what these organizations do, right, and how they're manipulated by the Western powers, right, to maintain a weakened economy, right, and weakened political systems, right, throughout the world. I'm just going to give one example, right, that to highlight this. Right. This is a quote taken, and this is taken from the book "The Wretched of the Earth." It was written by Frantz Fanon, who was a very important figure. I recommend that people read the book. He was active in Algeria in the 50s and early 60s. He wrote extensively about the psychological, sociological effects of sustained colonialism, right, in Africa. This quote is coming from a new release of the book in 2004 with an introduction written by a man named Homi Bhabha. And he's quoting from someone who was part of the World Bank, right, and his assessment of what the World Bank and the IMF are doing. Right? Now, the quote is from a man named Joseph Stiglitz, right? He was once a senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. Right? So this is an insider, right, after leaving office, you might say, his position there, writing a book, right, on the effects of globalization and the role of the IMF and other organizations. Right? So anyway, he says, and this is the quote, "There is an immediate argument to be made that suggests that the economic solutions to inequality and poverty subscribed to by the IMF and the World Bank, for instance, have the feel of the colonial ruler. Right? They help to create a dual economy in which there are pockets of wealth. But a dual economy is not a developed economy. It is the reproduction of dual, unequal economies as effects of globalization that render poorer societies more vulnerable to the culture of conditionality, through which what is purportedly the granting of loans turns at times into peremptory enforcement policies." Now, this is a big statement, right? And basically what it means, and this is what we've seen over 70 years now, of the IMF and the World Bank working in so-called third world countries. They give loans. The loans come with conditions. The countries have to carry out different policies, right? And these loans, because of those policies, where they say you have to organize your economy this way, you have to allow Western investors to come in and invest in your country. It very often meant preventing local populations from organizing, from labor movements, taxation policies, everything. And the loans come with all these conditions, and so these countries are given the loans, but the conditions prevent these countries from actually developing in any serious way. And this is why 70 years after the IMF and the World Bank were created, you still have most of the countries of the world borrowing from the World Bank, borrowing from the IMF, never being able to pay that back, never even being able to pay the interest back. And they just keep borrowing more, restructuring the loans. Right? And meanwhile, the economies remain weak. They remain based on natural resources, and you don't have any real development taking place. Yeah, it's a continuation of the traditional colonial economic policies. The first part, there is an immediate argument to be made that suggests that the economic solutions to inequality and poverty subscribed to by the IMF and the World Bank, for instance, have the feel of the colonial ruler. That's Joseph Stiglitz's own statement. And if you know anything, of course, about colonial economic policies, the whole thing was based on, the mother country and the colonized country. I mean, if you look at American history, the whole American Revolution was based on the British attempt to prevent industrialization in its colonies in North America. Right? And this was the thinking right up in it was French thinking right up after World War II. Why the French insisted on trying to keep their colonies in North Africa and Indochina in through the 1950s. Why there was these wars of national liberation, right? In Algeria, in Indochina. Famous names, particularly from Indochina, and Ho Chi Minh, and what becomes the Vietnam War, how the U.S. got dragged into it. This was all based on the idea that colonized countries have to supply raw materials to the so-called mother country. Right? So whether it's France, whether it's Britain, any of these powers, they want to keep the colonized territories producing the raw materials and not allow manufacturing. And this is continued on now. Things have changed. World War II, of course, brought an end to direct colonial control. Right? The British got out of India. They got out of different countries. The French tried to hold on. They had to fight these horrible, brutal wars where they carried out terrible massacres against the people. Right? But the colonial period comes to an end by the 1960s. Right? So the European powers have to switch their tactics and to make sure that the other countries don't actually gain freedom, don't actually gain political power, don't actually gain economic power. And these are the policies that are carried out today by IMF and World Bank. Well, this is what developed by the 17th century, 18th century. I mean, this goes back to the whole expansion of Europe, the creation of, joint stock companies, that they went out looking for raw materials, and those raw materials were sugar, cotton, spices from ginger, pepper from Southeast Asia, and human beings in the slave trade. So they were looking for these raw materials that weren't in Europe, and that they needed these materials, and simple things, tea, eventually tobacco, different things like that. So the Europeans go out in the 17th century, 18th century, looking for these European, these natural products, agricultural products, and then creating a whole economic system based on that. Anyway, let's move on with these points. The next thing I want to take a quick look at is the military, political, economic imperialism of Western Europe, of Western powers, is intertwined with several ideological concepts that emerged in Europe since the 12th, 18th century. So I want to take a look at just a few of these key things. These are very important ideas. People might have heard of them, right? But it's important to look at these larger ideological issues to understand where Orientalism is coming from. The first concept is something called scientific racism. Scientific racism was first developed by a man named Carl Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist credited with developing what's called the binomial nomenclature system to classify and organize plants and animals. Anyone who studies biology today is using this system. Right? And in the classification of plants and animals, it's very good. There's no doubt, as looking at the different plants and animals, looking at all the different features, right, of the different animals and plants, and classifying them. Right? Now his system of classification was based on a specific, normally phenotypic traits, right? And then this means that you look at the physical traits. How many petals are there, on the flower, and what are the different shapes of the leaves and the seeds, and so you make all this classification system. Now, what's important here is that this classification of plants and animals gets transferred to the classification of human beings. And so Linnaeus also creates a four-tiered classification of the human races, the human peoples. And he calls them Homo sapiens europaeus, so the European race, Homo sapiens afer, so the African race, Homo sapiens asiaticus, so the Asian race, and then finally Homo sapiens americanus, so the Native American. So these four groups. Right? Now the quotes I just gave, and this is, I want to point this out, comes from an article by Joel Z. Garrett titled "A Brave Old World, an Analysis of Scientific Racism and Bidil." Bidil is a modern heart medicine that's being sold to African American population in particular. And Garrett highlights that this scientific racism is still at play. It's still at play. And that drugs are being tailored for certain racial groups, not based on any what you might call sound scientific medical evidence. And this is, he goes into the details. I'm not going to go into those details, but the point is that he's claiming that scientific racism is still alive and functioning today, in the way pharmaceutical companies are trying to market certain drugs to certain people based on racial identity rather than any real medical scientific evidence. So you could look at his article for the details. Okay. Now, when we take a look at the racial hierarchy, and this is just a simple picture here of what emerges in the 17th and 18th century, is that the descending order of these racial groups. And of course, what did the Europeans do? They put the white European features at the top. They are the most important, the most perfected of the human race. Then you go down the list to the darker the color, right? So Asians and Americans, and then ultimately the darker the skin, the lower down the order you are. So Africans end up at the bottom of the heap. Okay, and it's all based on the facial features, the skin color, and then a whole series of ideas and judgments are made based on these physical features. Right? There's another chart I mentioned here where he outlines the characteristics of each group. Right? So for the Americans, meaning the Indians, right, the Native Americans, right, he says they're copper-colored and choleric and erect. Their hair is black, straight, thick, nostrils wide, face harsh, beard scanty, obstinate and content-free. Right? Paints himself with fine red lines, and he's regulated by customs. Right? So he's describing all Native Americans from Canada down to South America and saying that they're all like this, and they all have these physical features, and their cultures are all based on the exact same thing. When he comes to the Europeans, he says fair, sanguine, and brawny, hair yellow, brown, flowing, eyes blue, gentle, acute, inventive, governed with clothed with close vestments, governed by laws. Right? So he takes the qualities and characteristics of the Europeans, he puts them in the nicest terms, right? Governed by laws, and how physically and culturally superior they are. When he comes to the Asiatic peoples, right? He says sooty, melancholy, and rigid, hair black, eyes dark, severe, haughty, covetous, covered with loose garments, right? Governed by opinions. Okay, so again, all untrustworthy types of characteristics. Right? And finally, for the Africans, he says black, phlegmatic, and relaxed, hair black, frizzled, skin silky, nose flat, lips tuned, crafty, indolent, negligent, anoints himself with grease, and governed by caprice. Right? So he takes the physical features he sees and he lumps them with a whole host of cultural and racial descriptions, and he keeps this ranking. Right? And this carries through right up until today, right, in the scientific racism.